What is good, H0rr0rr? This is your boy Horror Gamer back with another video for you, and as you can tell by the title of this video, this is another Horror Gamer Reads. And yes, we are still working on Resident Evil, The Umbrella Conspiracy. So the last time we read this book, we got to know a little bit about Jill and Chris and Chief Irons, which I think there's something fucking suspicious about him. So, and there was a breakout, and there's a bunch of cannibalistic killings in Raccoon City and in the outskirts and stuff. So it's a good book. I mean, we're getting a little deeper. So with all that being said, H0rr0rr, let's just dive in and let's see where we're at, okay? All right. It says, Chris shook his head, listening to Iron's greasy voice. Hard to believe he'd once led the Raccoon Stars, even as a paper pusher. Maybe even harder to believe that he'd probably end up as mayor someday. Of course, it doesn't help much that he hates your guts, does it, Redfield? Yeah, well, Chris didn't like to kiss ass, and Irons didn't know how to have another kind of relationship. At least Irons wasn't a total incompetent. He had some military training. Chris pasted on a straight face and stepped into the small, cluttered office that served as the Star's filing cabinet and base of operations. Barry and Joseph were over by the rookie desk, going through a box of papers and talking quietly. Brad Vickers, the Alpha pilot, was drinking coffee and staring at the main computer screen a few feet away, a sour expression on his mild features. Across the room, Captain Wesker was leaning back on his chair, hands behind his head, smiling blankly at something. Chief Irons was telling him. Irons' bulk was leaned against Wesker's desk, one punchy hand brushing at his carefully groomed mustache as he spoke. So I said, you're going to print what I tell you to print, Bertucci, and you're going to like it, or you'll never get another quote from this office. And he says, Chris, Wesker interrupted the chief, sitting forward. Good you're here. Looks like we can stop wasting time. Irons scowled in his direction, but Chris kept his poker face. Wesker didn't care much for Irons either, and didn't bother trying to be any more than polite in the dealings with the man. From the glint in his eyes, it was obvious that he didn't care who knew it either. Chris walked into the office and stood by the desk. He shared with Ken Sullivan, one of the Bravo team. Since the team usually worked different shifts, they didn't need much room. He sat the unopened can of soda on the battered desktop and looked at Wesker. You're sending Bravo in? The captain gazed back at him impassively, arms folded across his chest. Standard procedure. Chris sat down frowning. Yeah, but with what we talked about last week, I thought... Irons interrupted. I gave the order, Redfield. I know you think that there's some kind of cloak and dagger going on here, but I don't see any reason to deviate from policy. Sanctimonious prick. Chris forced a smile, knowing it would irritate Irons. Of course, sir. No need to explain yourself on my behalf. Irons glared at him for a moment, his piggy little eyes snapping, then apparently decided to let it drop. He turned back to Wesker. I'll expect a report when Bravo returns. Now, if you'll excuse me, Captain. Wesker nodded. Chief. Irons stalked past Chris and out the room. He'd been gone less than a minute before Barry started in. Think the chief took a shit today? Maybe we all ought to chip in for Christmas. Get him some laxatives. Joseph and Brad laughed, but Chris couldn't bring himself to join in. Irons was a joke, but his mishandling of this investigation wasn't all that funny. The stars should have been called in at the beginning instead of acting as RPD backup. He looked back at Wesker, the man's perpetually composed expression hard to read. Wesker had taken over the Raccoon Stars only a few months ago, transferred by the Home Office in New York, and Chris still didn't have any real insight into his character. The new captain seemed to be everything he was reputed to be: smooth, professional, cool, but there was a kind of distance to him. A sense that he was often far removed from what was going on. Wesker sighed and stood up. "Sorry, Chris, I know you wanted things to go different, but Irons didn't put a whole lot of stock into your misgivings." Chris nodded. Wesker could make recommendations, but Irons was the only one who could upgrade a mission status. "Not your fault." Barry walked toward them, scuffling at his short, reddish beard with one giant fist. Barry Burton was only 6 feet tall, but built like a truck. His only passion outside of his family and weapons collection was weightlifting, and it showed. "Don't sweat it, Chris. Marini will call us in the second he smells trouble. Irons is just pulling your chain." Chris nodded again, but he didn't like it. Hell, Enrico Marini and Forrest Spire were the only experienced soldiers in Bravo. Ken Sullivan was a good scout and a brilliant chemist, but in spite of his STARS training, he couldn't shoot the broadside of a barn. Richard Aiken was a top-rate communications expert, but he also lacked field experience. Rounding out Bravo team was Rebecca Chambers, who only been with the STARS for 3 weeks, supposed to be some kind of medical genius. Chris had met her a couple times, and she seemed bright enough, but she was just a kid. It's not enough. Even with all of us, it may not be enough. He cracked open a soda, but didn't drink any, wondering instead what the stars were going up against. Billy's pleading, desperate words echoing through his mind yet again. "They're going to kill me, Chris. They're going to kill everyone who knows. Meet me at Emmy's. Now, I'll tell you everything." Exhausted, Chris stared off into space, alone in the knowledge that the savage murders were only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Barry stood by Chris' desk for a minute, trying to think of something else to say, but Chris didn't look like he was in any mood for conversation. Barry struggled inwardly and headed back to where Joseph was going through files. Chris was a good guy, but he took things too hard sometimes. He'd get over it as soon as it was their turn to step in. Man, it was hot. Seemingly endless trickles of sweat rolled down his spine, gluing his t-shirt to his broad back. The air conditioning was on the fritz as usual, and even the open door, the tiny STARS office, was uncomfortably warm. "Any luck?" Joseph looked up from his pile of papers with a rueful smirk on his face. "You kidding? It's like somebody hid the damn thing on purpose." Barry sighed and scooped up a handful of files. "Maybe Jill found it. She was still here when I left last night, going through the witness reports for about the 100th time." "What are you two looking for anyway?" Brad asked. Barry and Joseph both looked over at Brad, still sitting at the computer console, headset on. He'd been monitoring Bravo's progress throughout the flyby at the forested district, but for now, he looked bored as hell. Joseph answered him. Barry claims that there are floor plans in here somewhere on the old Spencer estate some architectural digest that came out when the house was built. He paused, then grinned at Brad. Except that I'm thinking that old Barry's gone senile on us. They say memory is the first thing to go. Barry scowled good-naturedly. Old Barry could easily kick your ass into next week, little man. Joseph looked at him mock seriously. Yeah. Would you remember it afterwards? Barry chuckled, shaking his head. He was only 38, but had been with the Raccoon Stars for 15 years. Making him the senior member. He endured numerous old age jokes, mostly from Joseph. Brad cocked an eyebrow. The Spencer place? Why would it be in a magazine? You kids gotta learn your history, Barry said. It was designed by the one and only George Trevor, just before he disappeared. He was the hot shit architect who did all those weird skyscrapers in DC. In fact, Trevor's disappearance may have been the reason that Spencer shut down the mansion. Rumor has it that Trevor went crazy during the construction, and when it was finished, he got lost and wandered the halls until he starved to death. Brad scoffed, but suddenly looked uneasy. That's bullshit. I never heard anything like that. Joseph winked at Barry. No, it's true. Now his tortured ghost roams the estate each night, pale and immaculated. And I've heard tell that sometimes you can hear him calling out, Brad Vickers, bring me Brad Vickers. Brad flushed slightly. Yeah, ha ha. You're a real comedian, Frost. Barry shook his head, smiling, but wondered again how Brad had ever made it to Alpha. He was undoubtedly the best hacker working for Stars, and a decent enough pilot, but he wasn't so hot under pressure. Joseph had taken to calling him Chicken Heart Vickers when he wasn't around, and while the Stars generally stuck up for one another, nobody disagreed with Joseph's assessment. So, is that why Spencer shut it down? Brad addressed this to Barry, his cheeks still red. Barry shrugged. I doubt it. It was supposed to be some kind of guest house for Umbrella's top execs. Trevor did disappear right about the time of completion, but Spencer was wacko anyway. He decided to move Umbrella's headquarters to Europe, I forget where exactly, and just boarded up the mansion, probably a couple $1,000,000 straight into the crapper. Joseph sneered. Right? Like Umbrella would suffer. True enough, Spencer may have been crazy, but he'd had enough money and business savvy to hire the right people. Umbrella was one of the biggest medical research and pharmaceutical companies on the planet. Even 30 years ago, the loss of a few $1,000,000 probably hadn't hurt. Anyway, Joseph went on, the Umbrella people told Irons that they'd sent someone in to check the place over and that it was secure, no break-ins. So why look for blueprints? Brad asked. It was Chris who answered, startling Barry. He'd walked back to join them, his youthful face fixed with a sudden intensity that almost bordered on obsessive. Because it's the only place in the woods that hasn't been checked over by the police, and it's practically in the middle of the crime scenes, and because you can't always trust what people say. Brad frowned, but if Umbrella sent somebody out, whatever Chris was going to say in response was cut short by Wesker's smooth voice, raising from the front of the room. All right, people, since it appears that Miss Valentine isn't planning on joining us, why don't we get started? Barry walked to his desk, worried about Chris for the first time since this whole thing had started. He'd recruited the younger man for the Stars a few years back thanks to a chance encounter in a local gun shop. Chris had proved to be an asset to the team, bright and thoughtful, as well as a top-notch marksman and able pilot. But now, Barry gazed fondly at the picture of Kathy and the girls that sat on his desk. Chris's obsession with the murders in Raccoon was unstoppable, particularly since his friend had disappeared. Nobody in town wanted to see another life lost. Barry had a family and was as determined as anyone else on the team to stop the killers. But Chris' relentless suspicion had gone a little overboard. What had he meant by that? You can't always trust what people say. Either that Umbrella was lying or Chief Irons was. Ridiculous. Umbrella's branch chemical plant and administrative buildings on the outskirts of town supplied 3/4 of the jobs in Raccoon City. It would be counterproductive for them to lie. Besides, Umbrella's integrity was at least as solid as any other major corporations. Maybe some industrial espionage, but medical secret swapping was a far cry from murder. And Chief Irons, though a fat, weaselly blowhard, wasn't the kind to get his hand any dirtier than they'd get accepting illegal campaign funds. The guy wanted to be mayor, for Christ's sake. Barry's gaze lingered on the picture of his family a moment longer before he turned his chair around to face Wesker's desk, and he suddenly realized that he wanted Chris to be wrong. Whatever was going on in Raccoon City, that kind of vicious brutality couldn't be planned. And that meant Barry didn't know what that meant. He sighed and waited for the meeting to begin. Chapter 2. Jill was deeply relieved to hear the sound of Wesker's voice as she jogged toward the open door of the Star's office. She'd seen one of their helicopters taking off as she'd arrived and been positive that they'd left without her. The Stars were a fairly casual outfit in some respects, but there also wasn't any room for people who couldn't keep up, and she wanted to very much to be in on this case from the beginning. The RPD has already established a perimeter search spanning sectors 1, 4, 7, and 9. It's the central zones we're concerned with, and Bravo will set down here. At least she wasn't too late. Wesker always ran meetings the same way. Update speech, theory, then Q&A. Jill took a deep breath and stepped into the office. Wesker was pointing to a posted map at the front of the room, dotted with colored tags where the bodies had been found. He hardly faltered in his speech as she walked quickly to her desk, feeling suddenly like she was back in basic training and had shown up late for class. Chris Redfield threw her a half smile as she sat down, and she nodded back at him before focusing on Wesker. She didn't know any of the Raccoon team that well, but Chris had made a real effort to make her feel welcome since she'd arrived. After a flyby of the other central areas, once they report in, we'll have a better idea of where to focus our energies. But what about the Spencer place? Chris asked. It's practically in the middle of the crime scene. If we start there, we can conduct a more complete search. And if Bravo's information points to that area, rest assured, we'll search there. For now, I don't see any reason to consider it a priority. Chris looked incredulous. But we only have Umbrella's word that that estate is secure. Wesker leaned against his desk, his strong features expressionless. Chris, we all want to get to the bottom of this, but we have to work as a team. And the best approach here is to do a thorough search for those missing hikers before we start jumping to conclusions. Bravo will take a look-see, and we'll conduct this by the book." Chris frowned, but said nothing more. Jill resisted the urge to roll her eyes at Wesker's little speech. He was doing the right thing, technically, but had left out the part about it being politic to do as Chief Irons wanted. Irons had made it clear time and time throughout the killing spree that he was in charge of the investigation and was calling the shots. It wouldn't have bothered her so much except that Wesker presented himself as an independent thinker, a man who didn't play politics. She had joined STARS because she couldn't stand the bullshit red tape that dominated so much of law enforcement, and Wesker's obvious deferral to the chief was irritating. Well, and don't forget that you stood a good chance of ending up in prison if you hadn't changed your occupation. Jill, I see that you managed to find the time to come in. Illuminate us with your brilliant insight. What have you got for us? Jill met Wesker's sharp gaze evenly, trying to seem as cool and composed as he was. Nothing new, I'm afraid. The only obvious pattern is location. She looked down at the notes she had on the stack of files in front of her, scanning them for a reference. The tissue samples from underneath both Becky McGee's and Chris Smith's fingernails were an exact match. We got that yesterday. And Tanya Limpton, the third victim, had definitely been hiking in the foothills. That'd be Sector 7B. She looked back up at Wesker and made her pitch. My theory at this point is that there's a possible ritualistic cult hiding in the mountains, 4 to 11 members strong, with guard dogs trained to attack intruders in their territory. Well, Horror Horde, I think that is a good stopping point. So now we have a little bit of some insight on what could be going on. It could be a ritualistic cult with attack dogs guarding their property. Who knows? So, with all that being said, Horror Horde, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you. We're getting into it now, boy. We definitely got some things going on. I mean, we got Chris wanting to smack fat ass Chief Irons, Wesker, who you can't really gauge. You know, he's cool, calm, and collected, but he seems like he's got his own agenda. You know, Jill, which her backstory seems a little meh. And then you got Barry. He seems like a cool dude, like a big muscular guy. Him and Joseph seem to be the two like best friends of the group because they're always constantly going at each other. So it's getting good, guys. We got some theories, but you know what? We still got a lot of book to cover. So, like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed this book, this video as much as I enjoyed making it for you. And don't forget, if you haven't done so yet, hit that subscribe button, along with that dingly ding ding button. That way, every time your boy Horror Gamer throws up one of these Horror Gamer Reads or anything like that, you're in the know. Also, run on over to the Z Network and see some of the awesome stuff that we got going on over there. A bunch of us creators got together to make something awesome. So it's something for everybody. So go in and head on over there. Also, while you're at it, go on over to the Horror Gamer Patreon page and see what kind of perks you get being a patron. I mean, we have everything from movie nights and all that stuff to just sitting down and talking and having a good time and stuff like that. I have 2 tiers. I'm not one of these guys who say, oh, 45, 25. No. We got a $1 tier and we got a $5 tier. You go there, check it out, see what we got, you know, see some of the perks, and yeah. So with all that being said, Horror Horde, I love you guys. Thank you guys. And until next time, this is your boy Horror Gamer saying, as always, don't fear the darkness. Embrace it.